Welcome, friend. You're safe now. The torches are lit low. The shutters are closed. The wind is howling softly outside your little wooden hut. Or your stone cottage. Or your urban tenement in 13th century Norwich. Wherever your imagination decides to settle tonight, it's time to drift slowly back through history, like a honey-covered fig rolling gently down a sloped wooden table. Tonight, we're going to talk about food. Not feast food, not famine food. Not the proud roast served at royal banquets or the bland porridge that kept peasants alive through long winters. No, we're going to talk about something far more sacred, far more familiar. We're going to talk about medieval junk food, snacks, treats, street food, little things stuffed into pies or rolled into sticky balls and handed over on the corner of a noisy, manure-strewn street. You see, people in the Middle Ages were, in many ways, not so different from people today. They worked long hours. Their feet got tired. Their backs ached. And sometimes, maybe often, they just wanted something hot, salty, greasy, and deeply questionable to shove into their mouths before trudging off to wherever they had to be next. The word snack wouldn't be coined for many centuries. The phrase junk food wouldn't show up until the 20th century. But the impulse? That universal craving to just eat something, anything, between meals? That was absolutely medieval. Only, instead of foil-wrapped chocolate bars or carbonated beverages, your options were a little different. A bit more local. And sometimes, alarmingly organic. Imagine it. You've just finished hauling sacks of turnips to the village market. You're starving. Lunch is hours away. But there, on the corner, a man with 3 teeth and a wide grin is selling fresh hot fritters. They're made of dough, probably fried in reused lard from last week, and seasoned with just a touch of whatever herbs happen to grow near his outhouse. But they're warm. They're crispy. And best of all, they cost only a farthing. You buy 2. You eat them on the way home. You immediately regret the second one. But for a moment, it was bliss. That, in essence, was medieval snacking. Of course, it depended on where you lived. A bustling city like London, Paris, or Bruges would be filled with vendors offering all kinds of makeshift street foods. But even in sleepy villages, you could find quick bites, pies filled with mystery meat, roasted nuts, candied roots, chunks of bread soaked in ale, and sometimes, just a hunk of cheese someone forgot to take back inside. If it could be sold and eaten fast, it had a place. And that's what makes medieval junk food such a fascinating thing to explore. It wasn't always sanitary. It wasn't always legal. And it was almost never healthy. But it was, like all good snacks, immediate, flavorful, and made to be devoured before anyone could ask what was actually in it. Let's also not forget the state of the average medieval mouth. Most people didn't have dental plans. Or teeth, frankly. Especially the poor. So junk food had to be soft, or fried into submission. Anything too chewy, too raw, or too tough would be difficult to enjoy if your back molars had long since abandoned ship. This is why so many treats were boiled, mashed, or baked into oblivion. The goal wasn't crunch. The goal was survival. With a side of pleasure. But there were also days when snacking wasn't just convenient, it was ceremonial. On religious feast days, for example, people often enjoyed sweetened buns or fritters. At fairs and festivals, stalls would pop up selling hot pies, pancakes, or chunks of meat on skewers. These weren't full meals. These were treats. Rewards. Moments of indulgence in an otherwise grey and muddy existence. And then there were the children. Children, with their endless appetites and sticky fingers, were particularly fond of sweets. Even if they didn't have modern sugar, they had honey. Lots of it. Honey was the original medieval sweetener, poured over nuts, fruits, bread, and even vegetables, transforming them into something vaguely candy-like. Picture a bored child in the 14th century gnawing on a honey-drenched parsnip and trying to pretend it was delicious. That was their version of a chocolate bar. Of course, the availability of snacks also depended on your social class. The rich had their own bizarre take on junk food, elaborate sugar sculptures, fritters made with almonds and imported spices, candied flower petals, and even marzipan shaped into animals and people. These weren't just snacks. They were edible status symbols, chewed slowly and proudly by people wearing several layers of embroidered wool. But for the rest of the population, junk food was simple, cheap, and probably handled with very dirty hands. Still, it served its purpose. It filled a hole. It offered comfort. And perhaps most importantly, it brought people together. Just as we gather around food trucks and corner shops today, medieval people gathered around street ovens, boiling pots, and smoky pans. They gossiped. They haggled. They burned their tongues. And in those moments, with hot food in hand, life felt a little less bleak. So tonight, as you drift off, picture yourself walking down a narrow, cobbled street. The air smells of smoke, mud, sweat, and something frying in pig fat. A vendor waves you over. You hand him a coin, perhaps you stole it from a monk, or earned it by mending a fence. He gives you a hot pie. You bite into it. It burns your tongue and tastes faintly of onions and regret. But for a fleeting moment, it is perfect. And that, dear listener, was the soul of medieval junk food. Now let's dive a little deeper into this strange, sticky world. Let's explore what the average street corner had to offer. Let's smell the spices. Let's watch the batter sizzle. And let's ask ourselves the eternal human question, what on earth did I just eat? It's early morning in a busy medieval town, perhaps London, or Paris, or York. The sun is rising slowly over the timbered buildings, and the town is already awake. You step into the narrow street and the smells hit you like a sack of flour to the face. Smoke from half fires, the sour reek of animal waste, fresh bread, stale beer, and something frying in a pan that hasn't been washed since last Pentecost. Welcome to the culinary chaos of medieval street food. Vendors are already yelling. Always yelling. They shout over each other to sell their wares, from baskets of wrinkled apples to skewers of roasted eel. They are loud, persistent, and incredibly persuasive, especially if you look hungry. Which you do. You're always a little hungry in the Middle Ages. Your first stop is the pie seller. Every medieval town had one. He's got a battered wooden stall and a stack of hot meat pies. What kind of meat? That's a question you never ask. It could be pork. It could be pigeon. It could be rat, on a slow day. The crust is thick and nearly inedible, not because it's gourmet, but because it's designed to keep out dirt and fingers. The pie is hot, oily, and tastes faintly of thyme and boiled bone. Delicious. Down the street, a woman is frying pancakes on a heavy iron griddle balanced over hot coals. The batter is thin, made of barley or rye flour, with bits of chopped onion or herbs folded in. She flips each one with her bare hands, unbothered by the heat, and sells them wrapped in leaves or scraps of cloth. You bite into one. It's chewy, greasy, and oddly comforting. The outside is slightly burnt, the inside still a little raw. Just the way it should be. Beside her, a boy no older than 12 is roasting something over a small open flame. At first you think it's a stick. Then you realize it's a skewer. And on the skewer, curled and sizzling, is eel. River eel, the affordable fish of the people. Slimy, rubbery, and full of bones, but rich in protein and cheap to catch. Eel was eaten everywhere in medieval Europe, and when roasted in street stalls, it became a favorite snack. You take a bite. It's slippery and smoky and reminds you, vaguely, of overcooked chicken wrapped in seaweed. A few stalls over, someone is selling offal. That's a polite word for the parts of the animal no one else wanted. Kidneys, livers, hearts, sometimes lungs. Chopped up, spiced, and fried in fat that's been reused so many times it's practically medieval itself. The vendor calls it fricassee. You suspect he just made that word up, but you're hungry, and the meat is hot, so you chew carefully and avoid thinking about where it came from. Then, there's the cheese seller. Not the fine, aged wheels reserved for nobility, but small clumps of soft, pungent cheese rolled into cloth and carried from a distant farm. It's sour, tangy, and has visible veins of blue mold. You buy a lump and eat it with a chunk of black bread from the next stall, the kind that makes your jaw ache and your stomach weep. It's dry, dense, and probably contains sawdust. But with the cheese, it's almost tolerable. You pause to drink. Water isn't always safe, so you take a mug of ale instead. It's weak, barely alcoholic, and cloudy with floating bits of barley. But it's cold and better than the alternative. A woman nearby is selling mulled wine in tiny ceramic jugs, warm, sweet, and spiced with cloves and cinnamon, if she's lucky. If not, it's just hot vinegar with ambition. Everything is noisy. Everything is messy. Chickens run underfoot. Someone drops a pie. A dog steals a sausage. No one stops. The market continues. The best part? It's all fast. Really fast. These aren't leisurely meals. These are grab-and-go bites, served hot and ready for workers, travelers, and anyone else without time or money for a proper sit-down dinner. It's the 14th century version of fast food. And it's glorious in its chaos. Some towns even had rules for it. In London, street vendors were regulated by local authorities to make sure food wasn't too spoiled, or at least not too dangerously spoiled. Bakers who sold undercooked pies could be fined. But of course, enforcement was spotty, and the average consumer had to rely on their nose, their eyes, and a generous helping of luck. And then there were the sounds. Clatter of pans, sizzle of oil, shouting of vendors, clanging of bells. The background noise of a town trying to feed itself one handful of fried dough at a time. You might see a group of young apprentices gathered around a stew pot, dipping crusts of bread into something that smells faintly of meat and strongly of cabbage. You might pass a cart selling roasted apples drizzled with honey, or dried figs stuffed with nuts. A few vendors are more creative, selling boiled eggs dipped in pepper, or meatballs rolled in breadcrumbs and fried until black. Occasionally, someone plays a fiddle nearby. Children dart between stalls, sticky-faced and barefoot. A monk buys a pancake and walks off without a word. There is no sign, no neon glow, no logo. Just the comforting presence of food in motion, simple, fast, and often a little unsafe. This was the medieval version of convenience. It didn't come in paper bags or wax wrappers, but it served the same purpose. It was food for workers, travelers, and the eternally hungry. It was hot. It was ready. And it was always better than starving. So next time you unwrap something greasy under a strip mall parking lot light, just know, you're taking part in a tradition as old as the town square. Now that we've sampled the street carts, let's move on to one of the kings of medieval portability, the pie. A crusty container of calories, comfort, and, occasionally, confusion. Let's see what was lurking beneath those medieval pastry lids. Let's settle into something a little more enclosed. Imagine yourself holding a pie. Not a sweet, flaky treat from a bakery, but a medieval pie. Heavy, greasy, slightly warm. It smells like meat, or maybe onion, or maybe despair. But you're holding it tightly with both hands because you know one thing for certain: this pie is your lunch, your dinner, and probably your breakfast if it keeps until morning. Welcome to the world of medieval pies, thick, crusty capsules of calories, created to fill bellies, not to delight taste buds. These weren't delicate affairs with decorative lettuces and fruit fillings. No, these were hearty, industrial-grade units of nutrition, designed less like food and more like edible suitcases. Medieval people loved pies. Loved them, especially in England, where the pie became an essential food item for nobles and commoners alike. But their obsession wasn't because the pies were particularly delicious. It was because they were practical. In a world without refrigeration, Tupperware, or reliable lunch breaks, the pie was a revelation. Let's talk about the crust. Today, we bake crust to be golden and flaky, something to be enjoyed. In the Middle Ages, the crust, called a coffin or half paste, was often too hard to eat. That was the point. It was made from flour and water, sometimes with a little lard or suet, kneaded into a tough, structural dough. Once baked, it formed a solid shell around the filling, which kept it insulated from dirt, flies, rats, and whatever else the outside world had to offer. You could carry this pie for days. Weeks, even. You could throw it down a well, fish it out, and it might still be edible. The crust was, in essence, medieval Tupperware. Inside. That's where things got interesting, and sometimes unsettling. Meat was the most common filling: minced beef, pork, chicken, or game, often mixed with spices, wine, and herbs to cover up the taste of, well, questionable freshness. Other pies were filled with fish, vegetables, or even sweet-savory mixtures involving fruits and nuts. But not all fillings were dead when they went in. There are stories, possibly apocryphal, but still terrifying, of meat pies that wriggled when opened. Whether from the inclusion of live eels or the result of meat that had been left a little too long before baking, some pies had a surprise inside. And not the good kind. And yet, people kept eating them. Pies were great for travel. Knights on campaign would carry meat pies in their packs. Merchants would eat them on the road. Farmers would pack them for the fields. The crust protected the filling. The filling provided protein, fat, and just enough joy to get through the day. If you were a wealthy noble, your pies were more elaborate. Entire birds could be baked into a pie, bones and all, spiced with cloves and pepper, layered with almonds, eggs, and figs. Some pies were even decorative, baked into the shape of castles, animals, or with sculpted pastry lids featuring scenes from the Bible or local gossip. There were also surprise pies, baked with live animals inside, like frogs or birds, to burst forth when cut open at a banquet. Less food, more chaos. But for most people, pies were utilitarian. Brown, dense, and alarmingly filling. Sometimes they were pasties, smaller, portable cousins of the pie. In Cornwall, the famous pasty became a miner's favorite. Half filled with savory meat and turnips, half filled with jam or fruit. The thick crust on the edge acted like a handle, so it could be gripped with dirty hands and then thrown away after eating. No forks. No plates. No napkins. Just pure, greasy efficiency. Not all pies were savory, though. Some were sweetened with honey or dried fruit, especially around religious festivals. Apple pies existed. Pear pies. Even pies filled with mashed peas and cheese, because why not? If it fit in the crust and didn't crawl away before baking, it could go in. Health-wise, they were less ideal. Heavy, greasy, and often packed with whatever was left over from yesterday's dinner. Digestion was not kind to the frequent pie eater. There are medieval medical texts warning against overconsumption of pie, citing indigestion, melancholia, and the heating of the humus. Yet people continued, stoically, to eat them. Because in the end, pies were food you could count on. They didn't need to be good. They just needed to be there. Picture yourself now, sitting on a low stone wall near a muddy road. The wind blows through your cloak. Your fingers are cold. You unwrap a pie from its cloth and bite into the warm, slightly dubious center. You chew slowly. Something chewy resists. Maybe a tendon. Maybe a pebble. You keep chewing. This is comfort. This is survival. This is lunch in the Middle Ages. So, if you ever feel guilty reaching for a convenience store meat pocket, just remember, you are honoring a 1,000-year tradition. A tradition of pastry-wrapped uncertainty and faith. A tradition of hunger meeting dough in the middle of a very long day. And now, let's move from these crusty wonders to something even more sticky and sweet. Because where there was no sugar, there was still honey. Let's take a look at the medieval world of candid horrors, when everything got dunked, boiled, and preserved in nature's original syrup. Settle in now. You're getting sleepy, aren't you? Let your limbs get heavy. Let your eyelids droop. Because we're about to step into the stickiest, sweetest, most questionably textured corner of medieval snacking. A place where flavor meets persistence. Where even a parsnip could become a treat. That's right, we're headed into the world of candid horrors. In the medieval world, sugar was a rare and precious thing. It existed, yes, but it was imported, expensive, and treated more like medicine than food. Apothecaries sold it in tiny amounts. Wealthy nobles used it to impress their guests. But for most people, sugar was about as attainable as a silk tunic or an uneventful bath. It wasn't a part of everyday life. So what did people use when they wanted something sweet? Honey. Sticky, golden, sometimes full of bee parts, and always available if you were willing to brave a hive, honey was the sweetener of the Middle Ages. It was in everything: porridge, pastries, meat sauces, wine, and most dangerously, it was in candied foods. Now, you might be picturing candy like we know it today, hard, colorful, individually wrapped. Not quite. Medieval candies were more like syrupy blobs. Sticky fruits, nuts, or vegetables that had been boiled or soaked in honey until they gave up any trace of nutritional value and turned into chewable sugar fossils. Let's start with fruit. Apples, pears, and plums were the stars. Chopped, sometimes dried, and then simmered in cauldrons of hot honey, they became dense and syrupy. Sticky enough to glue your jaw shut. Figs and dates, when imported, got the same treatment, stuffed with nuts, rolled in spices, and sealed in with even more honey. You didn't so much eat them as negotiate with them. But vegetables weren't safe either. That's right. In the medieval mind, nearly anything could be candied. Carrots, beets, parsnips, even cucumbers. If it had a surface and could be boiled into submission, it could be candied. The idea was simple: take something bland or bitter, cook it until it's soft, then drown it in honey until your teeth protest. Parsnips, in particular, were a favorite among the lower classes. Sweetened and mashed, they were rolled into balls and served as dessert. The texture? Somewhere between mashed potatoes and school glue. The taste? Like eating a warm, earthy sugar cube. Children loved them. Adults tolerated them. Teeth, as usual, suffered quietly. For the wealthier crowd, candied treats got more elaborate. Citrus peels, imported from southern Europe, were boiled and sweetened. Almonds were coated in honey and dusted with ground spices like cinnamon and ginger. Even flower petals, roses and violets, were candied, pressed between leaves, and served at fancy dinners as delicate, perfumed morsels. If that sounds romantic, remember that these petals were often handled by cooks who had just finished gutting a pig. Hygiene was flexible. There were also mysterious creations known as electuaries, a sort of medicinal candy. A mix of honey, herbs, and crushed plant material rolled into sticky pills. Technically a remedy. Practically a jaw workout. You'd be given one for digestion, or melancholy, or just because the town apothecary needed to move inventory. Candied nuts were another medieval staple. Hazelnuts, walnuts, and almonds were roasted and then stirred into honey until they formed clumps. These were sometimes pressed into molds, like tiny medieval energy bars, then left to harden into an impenetrable chunk. If you had teeth made of ivory and the patience of a monk, these were your reward. But not all candied treats were noble. In village markets, you might find peasants selling sticky lumps, a vague, local term for whatever had been candied that week. Maybe it was a handful of crabapples stewed in last year's honey. Maybe it was turnip peels and hope. Whatever it was, it came wrapped in cloth, stuck to your fingers, and left you licking your hands long after it was gone. Even drinks weren't immune. Honey was used to sweeten meat, of course, the original honey wine, but also to make syrups that were poured into ale, hot water, or thin gruel. Think of it like medieval soda syrup. Only with fewer bubbles. And more bees. In monasteries, honey confections were sometimes crafted by hand as special treats or medicines. Monks had access to herb gardens, bees, and free labor. Their candied offerings were probably among the most refined, even if they still had the mouthfeel of something bought in wax and forgotten behind a statue. And of course, candied foods were seasonal. Honey was a precious commodity, and full-on candying frenzies usually happened around holidays or festivals, Christmas, Easter, or the feast of a local saint. Children would line up with grubby hands for a single sticky plum. Adults might splurge on a honeyed walnut for their sweetheart. It was a luxury. A tiny, gooey miracle. So, how did these honey-drenched delights taste? Mixed reviews. If you were starving, they were heavenly. If you had a sensitive stomach, they were devastating. And if you were a dentist, which didn't exist yet, they would have been your worst nightmare. There's something poetic about it, really. In a world where sugar was rare, people still found a way to make things sweet. They boiled, baked, mashed, and smeared until they had something almost like a treat. It was messy. It was strange. But it was enough. So now, as you drift further into sleep, imagine a little child in a medieval town square. Sticky fingers. Sticky face. Grinning wildly as he chews a candied onion slice, blissfully unaware that it is, in fact, an onion. The sun is warm. The honey is warm. The bugs are, unfortunately, also warm. But no one minds. It's sweet, and that's all that matters. Now let's move on to the things you drank while licking your sticky fingers. Because what better way to wash down a honeyed carrot than with a warm cup of something bubbling quietly in a wooden tankard? Let's explore the mysterious, murky world of medieval drinks, some mildly intoxicating, some slightly poisonous, and all deeply questionable. You're still with us. Let your thoughts drift slowly now, like the foam on a mug of something warm and mildly suspicious. The fire is low. The day is ending. You're sitting in a wooden tavern, the bench creaking beneath you, the smell of boiled barley and damp cloaks all around. A tankard is in your hand, warm, cloudy, and gently fizzing. This, dear listener, is ale. The beverage that fueled the Middle Ages from dawn until dusk. The medieval smoothie. The drinkable bread. The liquid lunch. Let's begin with a simple fact: water was not trusted. At least, not in towns and cities. Wells could be contaminated. Streams could be full of things you didn't want to meet. So people turned to something safer, fermented, boiled, and a little bit alcoholic. Something that wouldn't kill them with a single sip. Something that filled the belly and dulled the edges of reality. Ale. Not to be confused with modern beer, medieval ale was often unhopped, warm, and weak by today's standards. It was cloudy, unfiltered, and had bits of grain still floating in it. Think of it as porridge you could drink. It was nourishing. It was cheap. And it was everywhere. From breakfast to bedtime, ale was consumed by nearly everyone: peasants, merchants, monks, even children. Yes, children drank ale. Weak ale, called small beer or small ale, was brewed specifically for them and for servants. It had just enough alcohol to prevent spoilage, but not enough to send a 7-year-old dancing on the roof. It was a drink, yes, but it was also food. A tankard of ale could contain enough calories to replace a meal. For the working poor, this was vital. You could stretch a single loaf of stale bread by soaking it in ale. You could wash down salted fish or hard cheese with it. You could trick your stomach into believing you'd eaten more than you had. Let's imagine a typical alehouse. It's small, smoky, and filled with voices. The walls are crooked. The floor is mud. A barrel has been tapped at the back. The ale is served in wooden mugs or simple ceramic jugs. There's no glass. No foam art. Just a frothy, beige liquid with a smell that lands somewhere between bread, damp hay, and regret. You drink slowly. The first sip is sour. The second is better. By the third, you no longer care that the man beside you hasn't bathed since last Lent. Ale smooths everything out. It was also a social drink. Alehouses were centers of gossip, singing, and low-level chaos. People came to drink, yes, but also to meet, argue, flirt, and occasionally fight. Ale had a way of making all of that seem more reasonable. And while the church occasionally grumbled about drunkenness, even monks brewed and consumed ale. In fact, monasteries often produced the best batches, rich, hearty, and sold to the public to fund charitable work, and nicer windows. But let's not get too romantic. Not all ale was good. Some of it was terrible. Spoiled, sour, or full of mysterious floaties. Brewed in dirty barrels. Left too long in the sun, or made by amateurs who had no idea what they were doing. But people drank it anyway. Because it was safer than water. Because it was better than hunger. And because it got the job done. Then came beer, which is different. In the early medieval period, beer wasn't common in England or France. It was mostly found in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in places like Bohemia and Germany. What made beer different was hops. Hops added bitterness and acted as a preservative, allowing beer to last longer than traditional ale. But hops were considered strange at first. In fact, in England, people were suspicious of hop beer well into the 15th century. They said it caused melancholy. They called it bitter in the worst possible way. Still, beer caught on. Slowly at first, then widely. By the late Middle Ages, beer was being brewed in towns and cities all over Europe. It was often stronger than ale, darker, and more flavorful. It could be exported, stored longer, and taxed more aggressively, something governments were particularly fond of. For the average drinker, though, the difference didn't matter much. Ale or beer, whatever filled the mug was what mattered. It was food. It was comfort. It was background noise for the teeth-gnashing reality of daily life. And it paired well with the only other things you had lying around. Like salted fish, dried, brined, or smoked until it was no longer recognizable as anything that once swam. Or moldy bread, sliced thin and toasted over a fire to disguise the green spots. Or cheese, hard enough to chip a tooth, and washed down with gulps of ale to soften the blow. Together, these formed the medieval snack combo, rough, salty, and soaked in barley water. The perfect trio to sustain you through a long day of fieldwork, till chasing politics, or surviving another sermon. Let's not forget alewives, the women who brewed and sold ale from their homes. They were everywhere in medieval towns, hunched over steaming pots, hauling buckets, scolding customers. Brewing was a household craft, and alewives were part entrepreneur, part chemist, part bouncer. Some became rich. Some were fined for watering down their batches. All of them were crucial to keeping the town both fed and slightly inebriated. And as you finish your mug and wipe your mouth on your sleeve, you feel calm. Sleepy, even. That's the ale talking. And the salted fish. And the fact that your stomach has officially given up on protesting. In the end, ale was more than a beverage. It was survival. It was nourishment. It was the medieval version of a snack and a drink combo meal, offered not with fries, but with a moldy hill of rye and a pickled herring. So as your eyes begin to close, remember that you are not alone in your need for something warm and dulling. Somewhere in the past, a tired farmer is lifting his own tankard. A weary cook is soaking stale bread. A monk is toasting nothing in particular, and smiling faintly. Ale binds us all. Like a soft fog of yeast and barley, it lingers. Now, let's leave the tavern behind. Because in a few moments, we'll be stepping into a darker corner of the medieval culinary world. The preserved meats, the dried blood, the uncomfortably chewy jerky. Let's talk about medieval protein snacks, where everything came salted, smoked, or possibly still twitching. Now that your belly's been filled with ale, and your fingers are still sticky from candied carrots, it's time to turn our attention to the crunchier side of medieval snacking. Something simple. Something portable. Something that cracked between your teeth and gave your jaw something to do while your brain quietly drifted toward a nap. Let's talk about nuts, seeds, and the roasted oddities that pass for treats in medieval life. Close your eyes. Imagine walking through a medieval market. The smell of wet wool and open fire mingles in the air. Chickens cluck underfoot. Somewhere, a man is yelling about turnips. And there, near the edge of the crowd, is a little brazier, just a metal pan balanced on bricks over a fire. Smoke wafts from it. And inside, roasting chestnuts. Charred on the outside, soft and floury within. A medieval street snack for the cold months. Chestnuts were one of the few nuts commonly available to the average person. They grew in forests, required no special processing, and could be roasted right over a fire. Simple. Filling. Slightly sweet. They were often sold by peasants trying to make a few coins in the colder seasons. The quality varied. Some were roasted to perfection, crackling shells with soft centers. Others were burned black, raw in the middle, or, more often than not, dropped in the mud and handed to you anyway. Then there were hazelnuts, another medieval favorite. These were smaller, harder, and often stored for winter. You could roast them over an open flame, grind them into a paste, or just smash them with a rock and chew carefully. When mixed with honey and spices, they became part of confections. But on their own, they were what we now call a casual snack, tossed in a cloth pouch, passed around during long walks or slow sermons, and often forgotten in someone's sleeve until spring. Almonds were more elite. Imported, expensive, and prized for both their flavor and their versatility. While poor folks might never see one, monasteries, noble households, and wealthy merchants often kept them in store. Roasted, spiced, or soaked in wine, almonds were both a luxury treat and a fasting substitute, because they weren't technically meat, but still rich and oily enough to fool your stomach into cooperation. Some enterprising folks even stole them from monastic kitchens, risking a whipping or a swift trip to confession in exchange for a handful of forbidden crunch. Seeds were less glamorous but no less popular. Poppy seeds, fennel seeds, and even hemp seeds were eaten roasted or crushed into pastes. You might find vendors selling little paper twists of toasted seeds, though the paper was probably scrap parchment or old laundry tacks. Seeds were cheap, easy to store, and perfect for idle chewing. They also got stuck in your teeth for days. A natural form of medieval dental floss. And then there were the questionable roasts. Sometimes, especially in colder months or during long fasts, people got creative. Peasants with no access to real nuts would roast acorns, after leaching the bitterness out with water, a process that took days. Or they'd toast broad beans until they cracked like tiny pebbles, sprinkle them with salt, and pretend it was just as good as a proper almond. It wasn't. But hunger is the mother of lowered expectations. Occasionally, street vendors would roast up more mysterious fare, hardened peas, chickpeas, even grass seeds or bits of dried grain. Toasted in oil or over hot stones, they offered a vague crunch, a whiff of char, and a high likelihood of getting something stuck in your molars for the next 3 days. Some vendors added spices, if they could afford them. A bit of cumin, coriander, or dried garlic could transform a handful of seeds into something almost tasty. But spices were costly, so most snacks were served plain, perhaps with a touch of ash, mud, or accidental twig for texture. Let's not forget that these weren't packaged neatly. Your nuts and seeds might come wrapped in a bit of cloth, or just scooped into your palm. Sanitation was more of a rumor than a practice. You might walk away from the snack stand with more than you bargained for, like a pebble, a bug, or someone else's thumbprint. But still, they were popular. Roasted snacks went well with ale, soothed hungry children, and filled time during long church services or chilly evening walks. They were what we might now call bar snacks, salty, crunchy, and endlessly consumable. Easy to share. Easy to spill. Hard to stop eating, even if your jaw started to ache. And speaking of bars, or rather, taverns, these nuts and seeds were often sold outside alehouses, offered by street vendors who knew exactly what kind of customer couldn't resist a little salty something between drinks. A drunk man might pay double for a handful of warm chestnuts. A tired woman might bribe her squirming child with 2 roasted peas and a burnt almond. Everyone had their price. In monasteries, things were more refined. Almonds might be lightly spiced and served on feast days. Chestnuts were soaked in milk or wine. Hazelnuts were ground into sauces for fasting meals. But outside the cloister walls, it was all smoke, soot, and whatever you could afford. So as you drift further towards sleep, picture this, a medieval street at twilight. Smoke curling from a little fire. A peasant woman with cracked hands stirring a pan of chestnuts. The sound of popping, the smell of singed wood and warm shells. A handful passed to you in silence. No words. Just the slow crunch of something roasted, warm from the flame, as the sky darkens and the bells begin to toll. And maybe, just maybe, one of the chestnuts is only mostly cooked. Next, we'll move deeper into the world of indulgent nonsense, where you discover the medieval love of fried doughs, fritters, and battered everything. Yes, before modern donuts, there were balls of dough dropped in questionable oil and called dessert. Get ready for sizzling pans, ruined fasts, and the original food coma. As we settle further into the quiet hum of medieval snacking, it's time to talk about something that's likely sitting somewhere nearby in your own kitchen: cheese. But don't picture the neat, wax-coated blocks or fancy wheels of today's supermarkets. Nope, medieval cheese was a whole different beast, stinky, soft, and sometimes crawling with little unwelcome guests. Cheese was, quite simply, the ultimate filler food. When your cupboards were bare, your fields barren, and your teeth fewer, cheese was what got you through the day. It was affordable, calorie-dense, and, most importantly, easy to store without refrigeration, at least for a little while. Now, why was cheese so popular? Let's start with what was available. The medieval world had a wide variety of cheeses, but many of them were quite rustic compared to modern standards. They ranged from hard, crumbly slabs to soft, pungent lumps that smelled like they had been marinating in the darkest corners of the barn for weeks. Some cheeses were made from cow's milk, others from goat or sheep, each bringing its own distinctive taste and aroma. Imagine a soft cheese, white and creamy, but with a smell so powerful that it could clear a room if left uncovered for too long. This was perfectly normal. In fact, the smell often indicated a rich, ripened flavor beneath. The softness also meant it was easy to spread on whatever you had handy, usually some stale bread or a thick slice of onion, which itself was often pungent enough to complement the cheese. Eating cheese with onions was a common pairing. Onions were cheap, robust, and could grow in poor soil, perfect for the common folk. The sharpness of the onion cut through the richness of the cheese, creating a bite that was surprisingly satisfying if you could get past the lingering breath afterward. But the medieval snacker didn't stop there. Pears, apples, and other fruits were often paired with cheese, especially in wealthier households. The sweetness and juiciness of fresh or dried fruit balanced out the salty, sometimes sour tang of the cheese. This mix of sweet and savory was a medieval version of snack plating, even if the presentation was far less elegant than today's Instagram spreads. Now, about the crawling part, this isn't a medieval myth or exaggeration. In a world without refrigeration and strict hygiene, maggots were a fact of life when it came to certain cheeses. Far from being a sign of spoilage, in some regions, cheeses were deliberately allowed to ferment with fly larvae inside. The maggots would break down the cheese, creating an intense flavor prized by adventurous eaters. This is the infamous kasumazu, a Sardinian delicacy that dates back centuries and was known in various forms across Europe. Most people, especially in towns and villages, didn't go quite that far. But it was common to find cheeses covered in mold, sometimes fuzzy and blue-green, sometimes slimy and white. This was considered normal and often a sign of ripeness rather than rot. Cheese was also used to stretch meals. A small wedge could flavor a pot of pottage, a thick vegetable stew, be melted into breads or pastries, or simply eaten by itself when no better food was available. It was a snack, a meal, and a survival tool all rolled into one. Cheese production was usually a household affair. Every farmstead had its own recipes, passed down through generations. Some cheeses were pressed and aged for months, others eaten fresh and soft within days. The quality varied wildly depending on the milk, the weather, the skill of the cheesemaker, and the cleanliness of the environment, which, let's be honest, was often questionable at best. And what about the less savory parts? Well, cheese could cause gas, stomach aches, and very bad breath. It could cling to your teeth like medieval glue and linger in your mouth long after the last bite. But despite these drawbacks, cheese remained a beloved staple. A practical, accessible source of fat and protein, always ready to be eaten whenever hunger called. So next time you're faced with a bland meal or a sad piece of bread, just imagine a medieval farmer tearing off a chunk of smelly, soft cheese and slapping it on a stale crust. They'd savor every bite, no matter how pungent, because cheese was comfort in a tough world. And as the night deepens and your eyes grow heavy, think of that farmer, the smell of their cheese mingling with the smoke from the hearth, the buzz of flies in the warm summer kitchen, and the slow, steady rhythm of a life lived bite by bite. Up next, we'll explore the sweet side again, but this time, the messy, deep-fried, often disappointing world of medieval fried doughs and festival foods. Get ready to meet the original greasy snacks. Picture a medieval kitchen lit by the uneven glow of an open fire, where thick, smoky air swirls with the smell of burning wood and something greasy and pungent. At the heart of this controlled chaos sits a large blackened pot filled with bubbling lard, suspended precariously over roaring flames that leap and hiss unpredictably. Deep frying was a risky business back then. There were no thermometers to tell you when the fat was just right, no timers to ensure your food didn't turn to charcoal, and certainly no fire extinguishers for when the inevitable flare-ups happened. Just a constant dance between heat, fat, and whatever scraps of dough or filling you could find. This was the medieval version of fast food, though it often came with the added thrill of singed eyebrows and the occasional kitchen fire. What could go wrong? Practically everything. The lard could turn sour and smoke so thick it stung your eyes, dough balls could stick to the bottom and burn into unusable lumps, food could fall into the ashes or slip between the cracks of the pot, and if you weren't careful, you might scald yourself with hot oil or set your clothes on fire. Despite all this, deep-fried snacks were wildly popular, and for good reason. Fritters were a staple of this greasy world. These were simple, dense balls of dough mixed with whatever was on hand, wild herbs like parsley, bits of onion, or slices of tart apples, dropped into the fat and cooked until their outsides turned a rough, uneven golden brown. Inside, the fritters were often doughy, sometimes even undercooked, but the combination of hot fat and savory or sweet filling made them strangely addictive. These weren't delicate pastries. They were filling, practical, and perfect for a quick bite on the go. Laborers, travelers, and festival attendees alike loved them because they were easy to carry in a pouch, easy to eat with dirty hands, and a satisfying break from the dull sameness of boiled vegetables and stale bread that dominated most diets. Their greasy texture might leave your fingers slick and your breath faintly porky, but that was part of their charm. Pancakes were another fried favorite, though they differed quite a bit from today's fluffy versions. Medieval pancakes were thinner, often dense, and made with a batter of basic flour, eggs, and milk or ale. Fried quickly in the same bubbling lard, they were usually eaten plain or occasionally dusted with a sprinkle of honey or sugar, luxuries that weren't always easy to come by. During fairs or religious festivals, vendors would carry their frying pans through the noisy crowds, shouting their wares as eager children and adults clamored for a warm, sweet treat. These simple pancakes were a way to enjoy a moment of indulgence, a small reward in a life that could be grueling and monotonous. But of course, deep frying came with its share of disasters. Fritters often emerged burned to a crisp or soggy and greasy. Sometimes the lard itself was rancid, imparting a harsh bitterness that could ruin even the freshest dough. There were frequent accidents, stray embers landing in the fat, causing sudden bursts of flame, pots tipping over, and the ever-present risk of severe burns. Kitchens were smoky, cramped, and hazardous places. Yet the risk was part of the allure. The hot oil created a texture and flavor that masked the often tough or bland ingredients, turning humble grains, herbs, and fruit into something much more palatable. Frying was a medieval trick to make food exciting and satisfying when fresh sugar and spices were rare and precious. This love of fried snacks didn't end with fritters and pancakes. Over time, medieval cooks developed recipes for all kinds of fried doughs, sweet dumplings, early versions of donuts, and other treats. These were denser and rougher than their modern counterparts, but they laid the foundation for the greasy, sweet comfort foods we know today. So, as your mind drifts towards sleep, imagine a bustling medieval festival, the clamor of voices, the flickering firelight, the scent of hot, fried dough thick in the air, and a vendor waving a pan of sizzling fritters. You reach out and take one, warm and oily, knowing it won't last long but savoring it all the same. As night deepens and the hearth's fire dwindles to glowing embers, imagine the humble medieval kitchen once again, but this time, it's alive with a different kind of magic, the slow, sticky alchemy of sweets being made. Medieval desserts weren't the neat, frosted cakes or bite-sized chocolates we're used to today. They were often dense, messy, and dripping with honey, a rare and precious ingredient that was worth its weight in gold. Unlike our modern sugar aisles brimming with countless candy options, sweeteners in the Middle Ages were scarce and expensive. Refined sugar was imported from distant lands and remained a luxury for the wealthy. For most people, honey was the only real sweetener, treasured not just for flavor but for its long shelf life and medicinal properties. Honey was harvested from wild or managed hives by brave beekeepers who used smoke to pacify the bees, risking painful stings. This golden syrup was then drizzled over bread or stirred into drinks, but it also became the base for many sticky desserts. The process of turning honey, nuts, and fruit into sweets was an art form in itself, though it rarely produced anything tidy or refined. Imagine sticky, gluey concoctions where whole nuts, almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts, were chopped or crushed and mixed into thick, honeyed masses. These mixtures were often flavored with exotic spices like cinnamon, clove, or nutmeg, which had traveled great distances along ancient trade routes and were treasured for their rarity. One popular treat was a kind of early nougat or marzipan, though far from the smooth, sugar paste we think of today. Medieval versions were rougher, made by pounding nuts into a coarse paste and mixing them with honey, sometimes scented with rosewater or infused with citrus peels. These sweet balls or pressed slabs were sticky enough to cling stubbornly to your teeth and fingers. Eating them required patience and a bit of determination, as they would slowly melt in the mouth, leaving behind a trail of honey and nut oils. These treats were not just snacks, they were symbols of wealth and celebration, often served at banquets and feasts. Dried and candied fruits also played a big role. Figs, dates, raisins, and even preserved apples and quinces were boiled down with honey into thick pastes or syrups. These fruit pastes were sliced and wrapped for storage, providing a portable, long-lasting sweet that could be eaten throughout the year. The flavor was intensely sweet and sometimes slightly tart, with a chewy texture that could stick to the roof of your mouth. For common folk, such sweets were rare and reserved for festivals, holidays, or as gifts. Imagine the excitement of a child unwrapping a slab of honeyed fruit paste, the stickiness threatening to ruin their best clothes, but the delight on their face making every messy moment worth it. Sweet pies and tarts were another category of medieval desserts, though they were very different from today's delicate pastries. The crusts were thick, sturdy, and more like edible containers than flaky layers of butter and flour. Fillings were often a mix of dried fruits, nuts, and honey or thick syrup. These pies could be enjoyed warm or cold, but eating them was always a sticky affair. Honey would seep from the cracks, and bits of nuts and fruit would cling to your fingers, requiring frequent wiping on a cloth or even a sleeve. Despite the mess, these pies were popular for celebrations and special occasions, where the sweetness and richness provided a welcome contrast to the usual salty or bland fare. Interestingly, medieval sweets were also used medicinally. Honey and certain nuts were believed to have healing properties, and sweets might be prescribed to soothe sore throats or improve digestion. This dual role of desserts, as both treats and remedies, shows how intertwined food and health were in medieval thinking. Yet, despite the allure of sweetness, eating these sticky desserts wasn't always easy or pleasant. The honey could crystallize, becoming grainy and hard. The nuts sometimes spoiled or turned rancid in storage, giving the sweets a bitter edge. And the sheer stickiness meant you might spend as much time cleaning your hands and face as actually enjoying the treat. But all these inconveniences were forgiven in the face of rare indulgence and the joy that came from a momentary escape into sweetness. So as you begin to drift into sleep, imagine the slow savoring of a honey-soaked nut bowl, the sticky sweetness clinging to your teeth, the crunch of walnuts under your tongue, and the warm glow of a small but precious delight in a world where sweetness was a rare luxury. This was medieval dessert, rough, messy, and utterly enchanting. Imagine stepping into a bustling medieval marketplace or tavern, where the noise of haggling vendors mixes with the smell of roasting meat, fresh bread, and something far less appetizing, the unmistakable stench of decay and filth. Food safety as we know it today was basically non-existent in the Middle Ages. There were no health inspectors, no refrigeration, and little understanding of bacteria or germs. This meant that eating out was a daily gamble, a risky venture where your meal might nourish you, or poison you. Most food was stored in conditions that would make modern food safety experts shudder. Meat, fish, and dairy products were kept in cool cellars or smokehouses, but without refrigeration, spoilage was inevitable. Spoiled meat was often disguised with spices or sauces strong enough to mask the smell, and sometimes people simply ate it anyway, hoping not to get sick. The same went for fish, which was salted or dried but often still turned rancid in the summer heat. Eating spoiled or contaminated food could lead to a range of illnesses, some mild, some deadly. Medieval physicians blamed imbalances of humors rather than microbes, but symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, and fever were all too common. Water was another huge problem. Clean drinking water was hard to come by, especially in crowded towns where wells could easily be contaminated with sewage or animal waste. Ale and beer were often safer because the brewing process killed many pathogens, but water sources were unpredictable. People commonly drank from rivers, ponds, or wells that were anything but clean. The result? Waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera ran rampant, causing widespread suffering and death. The places where people ate, taverns, inns, and market stalls, were crowded, noisy, and often filthy. Rats and mice scurried among the straw-covered floors, and flies buzzed over uncovered food. Cooking utensils and serving dishes were rarely washed thoroughly, if at all. Servers might use the same spoons and knives for different meals, spreading contamination. Even bread, a staple food, could be a carrier of disease if stored improperly. The concept of washing hands before meals was not common practice, meaning that germs pass easily from person to person. Despite all this, people continued to eat out regularly. For many, it was the only option. Peasants working in the fields or craftsmen in the city didn't have time or resources to cook elaborate meals at home. Market food was quick, filling, and affordable, even if it came with a risk. And for travelers, inns and taverns were essential resting points, offering hot food and drink after long journeys. The risk of foodborne illness was just another hazard of medieval life, accepted with a grim shrug. Some towns attempted rudimentary forms of food regulation, with laws against selling rotten meat or contaminated fish. But enforcement was spotty at best, and corruption or ignorance often rendered these rules ineffective. Public health knowledge was rudimentary, and outbreaks of food poisoning or disease were met with fear and superstition rather than practical solutions. In the end, medieval eating was as much about luck as anything else. You might enjoy a hearty meal of roasted meat and fresh bread one day, and the next suffer a week-long fever from something you ate at the market. Food safety was a gamble with high stakes, but the hunger of daily life left little choice. So, as you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine the brave souls of the past, biting into their meals with hope and a dash of courage, never quite sure if they'd enjoy a delicious feast or a dose of sickness. It's a sobering reminder of how far food and hygiene have come, and why the humble modern kitchen, with its fridge and sink and soap, is truly a blessing. Imagine a medieval village square or the grand hall of a lord's manor on a feast day. The air is thick with smoke, laughter, shouting, and the rich aroma of roasting meat and fresh bread. Feasts were the rare moments when everyday hardship was set aside in favor of abundance, indulgence, and social spectacle. These weren't quiet dinners but boisterous, messy affairs where the rules of daily life loosened, and food became a form of entertainment, and sometimes, outright chaos. A feast began long before the first bite. The preparations were monumental: whole pigs or oxen roasted on spits, large cauldrons bubbling with stews and pottages, tables heaped with piles of bread, cheese, and fruit. Sweets and pastries, often lavish and spiced with exotic ingredients, decorated the edges of the table. Ale and wine flowed freely, and servers darted about, balancing platters piled high with food. The sounds of minstrels or musicians filled the room, competing with the raucous chatter of guests. Feasts were social events designed to display wealth and power. Nobles hosted lavish banquets to impress visitors, forge alliances, or celebrate religious holidays. Common folk, when invited, marveled at the spectacle, though their portions were often smaller and simpler. Eating was done with hands or large knives. Forks were rare and considered a luxury. It wasn't uncommon for guests to engage in loud toasts, boisterous storytelling, and even bouts of drunkenness. Table manners were loose, and spilling food or drink was expected. Roast meats were the star attraction. Pigs, deer, geese, and even swans might be cooked whole. The smell of sizzling fat and crispy skin filled the hall. Carvers, skilled in their craft, sliced generous portions for the guests, often competing to serve the most prestigious diners first. Alongside the meats, mountains of thick, crusty bread were served, both as food and as a utensil for soaking up sauces and gravy. Cheese, pickled vegetables, and salted fish provided variety. Sweets and desserts, though rare during everyday life, made a grand appearance at feasts. Spice tarts, honeyed cakes, and candied fruits dazzled the eye and delighted the palate. The occasional use of sugar, saffron, and almonds was a display of opulence, as these ingredients were costly and imported. Sometimes, extravagant edible sculptures or pies with live birds inside would surprise guests, adding a theatrical element to the meal. The sheer volume of food meant that waste was common. Leftover scraps were often thrown onto the floor or fed to animals. Dogs, cats, and rats prowled the edges of the hall, ready to snatch whatever fell. Hygiene was not a priority, and the combination of spilled ale, food scraps, and crowded bodies created a pungent environment. Still, the joy and spectacle of the feast overshadowed these inconveniences. Feasts were more than just eating; they were a form of celebration, an expression of identity, and sometimes a political act. Invitations were coveted, and how one ate or drank could influence one's standing in the community. The communal experience of sharing food, drink, and stories forged bonds and eased tensions. For a few hours, the harsh realities of medieval life were replaced by a sense of abundance and connection. So as you begin to drift off, picture yourself in the warm glow of the hall, surrounded by the clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices, and the delicious chaos of a medieval feast. A time when food was more than fuel, it was a celebration of life, with all its messiness, noise, and joy. As the warmth of the feast fades and the night settles in, it's time to explore the curious world of medieval drinks beyond the ever-popular ale and beer. While ale was the go-to beverage for most, the medieval thirst was sometimes quenched by an intriguing assortment of herbal infusions, spiced wines, and even strange potions brewed in monastery kitchens or apothecaries. These drinks weren't just for enjoyment; they often came with promises of health benefits, magical properties, or at least a good buzz. Herbal drinks were common, made by steeping various plants, roots, and flowers in hot water or wine. These concoctions were thought to cure everything from indigestion to melancholy. Chamomile, mint, fennel, and rosemary might be mixed into teas that smelled faintly of an old herb garden, their flavors often bitter or earthy rather than sweet. Monks, with their knowledge of plants, were the primary brewers of such remedies, blending ingredients carefully, though not always successfully, to create potions that sometimes tasted more like medicine than pleasure. Spice wines were another favorite, especially among the wealthy. Wine was heated and mixed with honey, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and sometimes even rose petals to create a warming, fragrant drink. These spice wines were served during celebrations and cold winters, believed to chase away chills and lift the spirits. The combination of alcohol and aromatic spices made for a comforting sip, though the potent mix could easily sneak up on even the most seasoned drinker. These beverages were luxurious and expensive, often reserved for feasts or the tables of nobility. Some drinks ventured into the mysterious and magical. Alchemists and apothecaries crafted elixirs claimed to restore youth, boost strength, or protect against poison. Ingredients ranged from crushed gems and exotic herbs to animal parts, resulting in potions that were as bizarre as they were unpalatable. While few believed in their miraculous powers, these drinks added an element of wonder, and sometimes danger, to the medieval dining experience. Drinking one of these potions might leave you feeling strangely energized or, just as likely, queasy and confused. Fruit juices were rare but sometimes used in sweetening or flavoring beverages. Apples, pears, and berries might be pressed into juices or fermented into early versions of cider or mead. These drinks offered a different kind of sweetness, less sticky than honey but no less prized. However, the quality was unpredictable, and fermentation could lead to sour or even dangerous brews if not carefully managed. Water remained the least trusted drink, so many preferred these flavorful alternatives despite their oddities. The combination of alcohol, herbs, and spices masked unpleasant tastes and masked impurities, making medieval beverages both a necessity and a comfort. So, as you close your eyes and let your mind wander, imagine lifting a warm cup of spiced wine, its scent swirling with cinnamon and clove, or sipping a bitter herbal tea brewed deep in a monastery's kitchen. Medieval drinks were as varied and mysterious as the times themselves, sometimes comforting, sometimes strange, but always part of the story of survival and celebration. Picture a medieval kitchen or storage cellar, cool and dimly lit by flickering candles or small windows. Here, much of the magic of food preservation took place, a crucial craft that could mean the difference between plenty and starvation. Without modern refrigeration, medieval people faced a constant battle against rot and spoilage. The techniques they developed to keep food from turning into smelly, crawling disasters were ingenious, messy, and sometimes downright strange. One of the oldest and most reliable methods was salting. Salt was highly prized, not only as a seasoning but as a powerful preservative. Meat and fish were soaked in large amounts of salt or packed in salt layers to draw out moisture and create an environment hostile to bacteria. This process could take days or weeks, depending on the size of the meat cuts and the climate. Salted herring and cod became staple preserved foods, able to travel long distances and last through harsh winters. However, the taste was intensely salty, and the texture often tough and leathery, requiring soaking or boiling before eating. Still, salt was the key to survival in a world without refrigeration. Another favorite method was smoking. Meat, fish, and sometimes cheese were hung in smokehouses where smoldering wood, often oak, beech, or fruitwoods, released fragrant smoke that coated the food. The smoke not only added flavor but also helped to dry and preserve the food by slowing bacterial growth. Smokehouses were small, smoky chambers filled with the thick, pungent aroma of burning wood and curing meat. The resulting products were richly flavored but could be tough or bitter if smoked too long. Despite these downsides, smoked food was a delicacy and a necessity, especially for those who needed to store food for months. Drying was another common technique, particularly for fruits, herbs, and grains. Sun-drying or air-drying removed moisture and extended shelf life. Dried fruits like raisins, figs, and dates were sweet treats that could be stored for long periods and used in cooking or eaten as snacks. Grains were carefully threshed, cleaned, and stored in dry granaries to keep them safe from mold and pests. Drying was a simple but essential way to preserve seasonal harvests for year-round consumption. Medieval cellars and cool storage rooms also played a vital role in preservation. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were stored in pits or underground cellars, where the temperature remained relatively stable. These cool, dark spaces slowed spoilage and kept food fresh for months. People often covered vegetables with straw or sand to protect them from moisture and pests. Such storage methods were primitive but effective, forming the backbone of winter food supplies. Some preservation methods might sound odd today. For example, people sometimes coated cheese or bread with wax, ash, or even mud to keep insects away and slow drying. Others used pickling in vinegar or brine, which both preserved and flavored vegetables and fish. These pickled foods added variety to the medieval diet and could be stored safely for months. Despite all these efforts, preservation was never perfect. Mold, maggots, and decay were constant threats, and spoiled food could cause illness or worse. People learned to spot the signs of bad food, off smells, discoloration, or slimy textures, but desperation sometimes forced them to eat questionable meals. The struggle to keep food from rotting was a daily challenge, one that shaped medieval life and diet in profound ways. So, as you nestle into your blankets, imagine the cool, smoky air of a medieval smokehouse or the damp earth of a root cellar where precious food was stored with care and hope. These preservation techniques, salt, smoke, drying, and storage, were lifelines in a world without modern conveniences, keeping the promise of tomorrow's meal alive just a little longer. As we drift deeper into the medieval pantry, it's time to explore the curious world of sweets and snacks, not the candy bars or cookies we know today, but strange, sticky concoctions and unusual treats that tease the palate in unexpected ways. Sugar was rare and expensive, so the medieval sweet tooth turned to alternatives like honey, fruits, nuts, and spices to satisfy cravings. The results could be delicious, odd, or somewhere in between. Honey was the cornerstone of medieval sweetness. This golden syrup was used to candy fruits and nuts, creating sticky, chewy morsels that could last for weeks. Apples, pears, and even carrots might be dipped in honey and dried to form early versions of candied snacks. These treats were prized for their sweetness and portability, perfect for travelers or children. However, honey-coated foods could become gooey traps for flies and insects, and sometimes they stuck stubbornly to teeth, no doubt a challenge for medieval dental hygiene. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were scattered liberally into sweet dishes. Their exotic aromas came from faraway lands and were a sign of wealth and status. Spiced cakes and tarts often combined dried fruits with nuts and honey, baking them into dense, heavy pastries that offered a burst of flavor in every bite. These treats were served at feasts and special occasions, offering a rare indulgence amid the daily bread and cheese. One of the more puzzling medieval sweets was the marzipan, made from finely ground almonds and sugar or honey. Shaped into tiny fruits, animals, or even faces, marzipan was both a treat and a showpiece. Skilled confectioners crafted these edible sculptures as decorations for banquets or gifts for the wealthy. Their sweet, nutty flavor was a welcome contrast to the often bland or salty fare of the day. Candied nuts were also popular, coated in sugar or honey and sometimes roasted to a crisp. Chestnuts, almonds, and walnuts became crunchy, sweet snacks that travelers and townsfolk alike could nibble on. Yet, without modern roasting methods, these nuts could easily burn or remain half raw, giving them a smoky or bitter edge that divided opinions. For those who couldn't afford sugar or exotic spices, fruits were often dried or stewed with honey to create natural sweets. Raisins, figs, and dates were prized not just for their sweetness but for their long shelf life, making them essential ingredients in many medieval recipes. Stewed fruit might be served with cheese or bread, creating a sweet-savory combination that seems unusual today but was common then. Surprisingly, some vegetables found their way into sweets. Carrots and parsnips, for example, were sometimes cooked with honey and spices to create sticky, sweet side dishes or snacks. These vegetable sweets reflected the medieval tendency to blur the lines between savory and sweet, a culinary style quite different from modern tastes. Despite these sweet delights, medieval sweets were rarely consumed in large quantities. Their ingredients were expensive and scarce, so sweets were treats for special occasions rather than everyday snacks. The sticky, heavy textures and strong flavors also meant that medieval people developed a taste quite different from ours, one that appreciated richness, spice, and complexity over lightness or simplicity. So, as you relax and let your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the scent of honey and spices filling a medieval kitchen, the sight of gleaming marzipan animals, and the taste of chewy candied fruits. These sweets and snacks, strange as they may seem now, were little treasures, offering a touch of sweetness and joy in a harsh, unpredictable world. Imagine waking up in a modest medieval home, the morning light just filtering through small windows. The day ahead promises hard labor, long hours, and little rest. Breakfast was not a casual, leisurely meal but a necessary fuel-up, sometimes heavy, sometimes odd, and rarely sweet or delicate. It was the meal to prepare the body for the day's demands, not to indulge the palate. For most common folk, breakfast was a simple, hearty affair. Porridge made from barley, oats, or rye was a staple, cooked slowly over the fire into a thick, mushy mess. This porridge was often plain or mixed with a pinch of salt, herbs, or leftover bits of meat or fish if available. Sometimes, a splash of ale or sour milk was added, making it more filling and flavorful. The texture was coarse, and the taste could be bland or sour, but porridge provided essential energy and warmth on cold mornings. Bread was another common component. Thick, dense loaves, often stale by the morning, were sliced and eaten with cheese, butter, or a smear of honey if the household was lucky enough to have it. The bread was heavy and coarse, made from whole grains, and sometimes mixed with bran or rye, making it tougher and less refined than today's bread. This bread and cheese combo was practical and quick, providing carbohydrates and fats to sustain long work hours. For those who could afford it, breakfast might include cold leftovers from the previous day's meal, bits of meat, fish, or pies eaten cold and sometimes dipped in ale or broth. This practice wasn't considered strange. Medieval people valued nothing wasted, and cold leftovers were a convenient and filling option. Breakfast rarely featured sweet foods or fresh fruit. Sweets were mostly reserved for special occasions or desserts after the main meal later in the day. Instead, the flavors of breakfast were often savory, salty, or sour, designed to wake the senses and fortify the body. It was fuel, not pleasure. Interestingly, the timing and importance of breakfast varied widely. Nobles might have a later, more elaborate breakfast, including bread, cheese, eggs, and sometimes wine or spiced wine. But for peasants and laborers, breakfast was eaten quickly and early, often standing or on the go, before heading out to work in the fields or workshops. Drinks for breakfast were usually ale or small beer, low-alcohol versions that were considered safe and hydrating compared to often contaminated water. Milk was consumed when available but was less common than ale. Tea and coffee were unknown in medieval Europe, so mornings lacked the caffeine buzz many of us depend on today. So, as you settle down and begin to drift off, picture a quiet medieval kitchen with a simple pot of porridge simmering over the fire, a loaf of coarse bread waiting to be sliced, and a humble mug of ale ready to warm the hands and belly. Breakfast was a practical meal, designed to prepare people for the harsh realities ahead, not to pamper or delight but to sustain and fortify. Next, we'll explore the medieval mindset around food and health, how beliefs about humus and balance shaped what people ate and how they thought about nutrition. As we wind down our journey through medieval eating habits, it's time to peek into the fascinating world of medieval food and health beliefs, a world where what you ate wasn't just about flavor or filling your belly, but about balancing invisible forces inside your body. The medieval mind saw food as both medicine and magic, a way to keep the delicate humus in check and maintain harmony within. Central to medieval health theory was the idea of the four humus: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor corresponded to specific qualities like hot, cold, wet, or dry, and people believed that illness or imbalance in these humors caused disease. Food played a crucial role in correcting or maintaining this balance. Eating the right foods, at the right time, and in the right amounts was considered essential to good health. Foods themselves were classified according to their qualities. Some were hot and dry, like garlic and mustard, believed to stimulate the body and clear excess moisture. Others were cold and wet, such as cucumbers and dairy, thought to cool the body and soothe inflammation. Medieval cooks and doctors often recommended specific foods to cool or warm the body depending on a person's condition, season, or temperament. For example, if someone was thought to have too much phlegm, associated with cold and wet, they might be advised to eat hot and dry foods to restore balance. Conversely, someone with an excess of yellow bile, hot and dry, might be told to consume cold and wet foods. This belief influenced everything from the choice of meals to the timing and preparation methods. Spices, herbs, and even cooking techniques had medicinal importance. Pepper, cinnamon, and ginger were prized not only for flavor but for their warming properties, helping to balance cold humus. Boiling or roasting might be preferred over raw or fried foods for their perceived effects on the body's temperament. Interestingly, medieval meals often combined foods with contrasting qualities, aiming to create a balanced plate. This approach might explain some of the strange pairings of sweet and savory, heavy and light, or fresh and pickled foods. The goal was always harmony, both of the body and of the meal itself. The humoral theory also shaped social eating habits. Nobles often consumed rich, heavy foods believed to increase heat and dryness, matching their active, sometimes stressful lifestyles. Peasants ate simpler, wetter foods like porridge and vegetables, thought to keep them cool and calm. Beyond humus, food was thought to affect moods and behavior. Certain foods were believed to calm anger, increase courage, or induce sleep. Eating well was more than survival, it was part of maintaining a good life, both physically and spiritually. Of course, this theory wasn't always accurate, and many medieval health practices seem strange or ineffective today. But it shows how deeply intertwined food and medicine were in medieval culture, a reminder that what we eat has always been more than just calories. So, as you get cozy and let your thoughts drift, imagine a medieval table where every dish is chosen not just for taste but for its power to heal and balance. The medieval mind's delicate dance with food and health was a world where eating was a sacred act, a careful science, and sometimes a hopeful magic. Thank you for joining this slow stroll through medieval snacking and food lore. May your dreams be as rich and strange as the treats of the past. Medieval snacking might seem like a modern concept, but people in the Middle Ages loved quick, tasty bites just as much as we do, though with some very different ingredients and cooking methods. Imagine dusty streets bustling with vendors selling all sorts of treats. The term junk food didn't exist, but the spirit was the same: fast, flavorful snacks that could be eaten on the go, often messy and packed with calories. Unlike today's slate wrappers and quick service counters, medieval street food was served loud, greasy, and full of character. Strolling through a medieval market or town square, the smells of fried pancakes, grilled eel skewers, and steaming meat pies filled the air. Street vendors shouted over the crowd, hawking their greasy delicacies. Meat pies were especially beloved, not just because they were tasty, but because their thick, bread-like crusts doubled as edible packaging. These pies could hold a variety of fillings: beef, pork, mutton, and sometimes something less recognizable, moving or twitching occasionally if not cooked thoroughly. This portability was crucial for travelers, laborers, and anyone needing a meal on the go. However, these pies were notoriously hard to digest and often caused stomach troubles. Medieval street snacks also included pancakes fried in questionable oils and fish skewers grilled over open flames, dripping fat onto glowing coals. While the hygiene standards would be questionable by modern norms, these foods were wildly popular among all classes. For the common folk, street food was a necessary and affordable way to satisfy hunger between meals or during long workdays. Not all medieval snacks were savory. The sweet tooth found expression in the form of candied fruits and nuts drenched in honey. Sugar was a rare and precious commodity, so honey played the starring role in sweetening treats. Fruits like apples, pears, and sometimes even vegetables were candied, covered in sticky honey and dried into chewy, sweet morsels. While delightful, these sticky snacks often trapped flies and other insects, making medieval sweets a little less hygienic than their modern counterparts. All in all, medieval snacking was vibrant, varied, and deeply embedded in daily life. The notion of grabbing something quick and tasty wasn't new, it just had a very different flavor and texture than what we expect today. The Middle Ages valued portability and preservation in food, especially for those constantly on the move. Pies and pasties were popular because their sturdy crusts protected the filling and served as a makeshift plate and spoon. Meat fillings often included various meats, sometimes mixed with awful or less desirable cuts, and seasoned with whatever herbs or spices were available. These portable snacks were favorites among travelers, merchants, and peasants alike, but their heavy crusts were hard on digestion, leading to the term coffin lids in some regions because the crust was often discarded or left uneaten. Alongside pies, medieval people loved their ale and beer, which were safer and more common than water. These fermented beverages were more than drinks, they were often consumed all day, dulling the senses and filling the belly. Alehouses served salted fish, stale or moldy bread, and other salty snacks, creating an atmosphere of communal eating and drinking that was rowdy, loud, and full of life. Nuts and seeds, especially roasted chestnuts and almonds, were the medieval equivalent of modern bar snacks. Sold on street corners or stolen from monasteries, these nuts were sometimes burnt or under-roasted, giving them a smoky, uneven flavor. Despite this, they were wildly popular as quick energy bites or additions to meals. The act of roasting nuts over open flames gave off a distinct aroma, marking the streets with the scent of toasted chestnuts in autumn and winter. Cheese was another crucial medieval snack, glorious in its variety and sometimes downright pungent. From soft, stinky cheeses crawling with mites to hard, aged varieties, cheese was eaten with everything from onions to pears to very stale bread. It was cheap, filling, and a reliable source of protein and fat, often making up a significant portion of a peasant's diet. Deep-fried treats such as fritters and pancakes were another indulgence, despite the risks of cooking in hot lard over open flames. These snacks could be stuffed with herbs, apples, or other fillings, creating an oddly addictive, crispy, and greasy treat. Though accidents and disasters in the cooking process were common, the appeal of hot, fried food was undeniable in a cold and harsh world. Food preservation was an ongoing challenge in the Middle Ages, long before refrigeration. Salt was a precious commodity used extensively to cure meats and fish, soaking them in brine to remove moisture and prevent bacterial growth. The resulting salted herring or cod could last for months and travel great distances, though it was intensely salty and tough. Smoking was another key preservation method. Meat and fish were hung in smokehouses where the thick, fragrant smoke helped dry and cure them. The smell of smoked foods was omnipresent in medieval towns, blending with the sense of burning wood and cooking fires. Drying fruits, grains, and herbs was a simple but effective way to prolong shelf life. Dried fruits such as raisins, figs, and dates were sweet treasures, often used in baking or eaten as snacks. Root cellars provided cool, dark storage for vegetables like onions, carrots, and turnips, which helped keep them fresh through the winter months. Some preservation techniques might seem strange today, such as coating cheese or bread with ash or mud to ward off pests, or pickling vegetables and fish in vinegar or brine. These methods not only preserve food but sometimes enhance flavors and textures. Turning to sweets, medieval people satisfied their sugar cravings with honey-drenched delights. Since sugar was expensive, honey was the primary sweetener, used to candy fruits, nuts, and even vegetables. Honey-coated apples and pears became sticky, chewy treats loved by children and adults alike, though they could trap insects and leave teeth sticky. Exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg-flavored sweet cakes and pastries, often baked for feasts or special occasions. Marzipan, made from almonds and honey or sugar, was shaped into delicate fruits, animals, or faces, serving both as a dessert and edible decoration at banquets. Candied nuts were also a popular snack, though the roasting was often uneven, giving some nuts a burnt or raw taste. The medieval sweet tooth was adventurous and resourceful but quite different from modern tastes. Sweets were often dense, spicy, and richly flavored, enjoyed sparingly due to their cost. Medieval meals reflected a practical approach rather than a focus on pleasure, with breakfast being particularly utilitarian. Far from today's light or sweet morning meals, medieval breakfasts were designed to fuel hard work. Common folk ate thick porridge made from barley, oats, or rye, coarse, sometimes sour, and often mixed with leftover meat or fish for flavor and sustenance. Bread was dense and heavy, typically stale by morning, eaten with cheese, butter, or honey if available. For the wealthy, breakfast could be more elaborate, featuring spiced breads, eggs, or wine. However, for most peasants, breakfast was a quick, necessary meal consumed early before heading into the fields or workshops. Drinks were usually ale or small beer, safer than often contaminated water, providing hydration and calories. Medieval food and health beliefs were deeply entwined with the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each representing qualities like hot, cold, wet, and dry. Health was thought to depend on balancing these humours, and food was prescribed accordingly. Spices and cooking methods were chosen to heat or cool the body. Hot, dry foods like garlic and mustard were used to counteract cold, wet humours. Cold, wet foods like cucumbers and dairy balance hot, dry humours. This belief influenced not just diet but also mood and behavior, with certain foods believed to calm anger, increase courage, or induce sleep. Meals were crafted with a focus on balance, combining contrasting foods to maintain harmony in body and mind. Though medieval nutritional science was flawed by today's standards, it reveals how seriously people took their food and health, seeing eating as both sustenance and medicine. As you drift off, imagine the thick porridge warming a weary medieval worker, the smoky tang of cured meats hanging in the air, and the delicate sweetness of honey treats, reminders of a world both harsh and fascinating, where food was more than just fuel, it was survival, culture, and comfort. Imagine, if you will, a bustling medieval town, its streets alive with the chatter of merchants, the clatter of hoofs, and the ever-present aroma of cooking fires. The idea of junk food as we know it today, crispy chips, sugary sodas, instant snacks, didn't exist, of course, but snacking was definitely a thing. Medieval people loved quick bites, treats to stave off hunger between heavy meals, and foods that could be grabbed and eaten on the go, sometimes with very questionable ingredients and cooking methods. People in the Middle Ages didn't have the luxury of modern refrigeration, mass-produced packaging, or even the word snack. But they craved the same quick, satisfying munchies that we do now. The streets were filled with vendors shouting to be heard over the crowd, selling everything from greasy meat pies to skewered eels, and from thick pancakes fried in lard to sticky honey-drenched fruits. The scene was loud, greasy, chaotic, and utterly beloved. One of the staples of medieval street food was the meat pie, thick, dense, and filling. These pies were more than just food. Their crust served as edible packaging, designed to protect the sometimes squirming, often dubious fillings inside. Imagine biting into a pie, only to find your meat filling twitching if it wasn't cooked well enough, a less appetizing feature for us today, but a practical and portable solution for people constantly on the move. These pies, known for their heavy crusts, were favorites among travelers and laborers but were notorious for being hard on digestion. You could think of them as the original fast food, designed for portability and calories rather than taste or health. Alongside pies, the smell of frying pancakes, cooked in reused, smoky oils, would have drawn crowds eager for a warm snack. These pancakes were dense and often savory, sometimes sweetened with honey or filled with herbs and apples. Though the cooking methods left much to be desired by modern hygiene standards, the irresistible combination of crispy edges and soft insides made them a popular treat for people from all walks of life. The sweetness in medieval snacks came primarily from honey. Sugar was rare and expensive, so honey was king. Fruits, nuts, and sometimes even vegetables were candied by coating them in thick honey and letting them dry into chewy, sticky morsels. Imagine sticky apple slices or honey-coated almonds, delicious, yes, but often attractants for flies and other less welcome guests. This honey-drenched candying process made sweets an indulgence, reserved mostly for special occasions or those with access to beekeeping. While water was often contaminated and unsafe, ale and beer were the drinks of choice, consumed throughout the day by nearly everyone. These fermented beverages were cheap, filling, and safer than water, with the added bonus of dulling the senses and warming the body. Drinking ale with salty snacks like pickled fish or old bread was a common pairing, creating a communal atmosphere in bustling taverns and alehouses. Street corners often hosted vendors selling roasted chestnuts, almonds, and other nuts, medieval bar snacks, if you will. These were sometimes burnt, sometimes undercooked, and occasionally even stolen from monasteries, but their smoky aroma was a comforting sign of the season. The simple pleasure of cracking open a roasted chestnut or nibbling on a crunchy almond was a small but welcome treat in a world of hard labor and scarce luxuries. Cheese, glorious cheese, played a starring role in medieval diets. Far from the neat wheels and blocks of today's supermarkets, medieval cheese was often pungent, soft, and sometimes crawling with tiny mites. It was eaten with everything, onions, pears, stale bread, and served as an affordable, filling source of protein and fat. Cheese was the go-to filler for many meals, reliable and available even when other foods were scarce. Then there were fritters and pancakes, deep-fried in lard over open flames. Cooking in hot lard was risky business, fires could flare up, oil could splatter, but the resulting crispy, greasy treats were oddly addictive. Fritters stuffed with herbs, apples, or cheese offered a delicious contrast to the often bland and heavy medieval diet. Despite the dangers, fried foods provided warmth and comfort, especially during cold winters. Preservation of food was always a challenge. Salt was precious and widely used to cure meats and fish, which were then stored for months. Smoking added another layer of flavor and longevity, with meats and fish hung in smokehouses to dry out and absorb thick layers of smoky aroma. Pickling vegetables and fish in vinegar or brine was also common, sometimes improving flavors and texture in unexpected ways. Drying fruits, grains, and herbs helped keep supplies stable through long winters. Root cellars stored onions, carrots, and turnips, providing necessary vitamins when fresh food was scarce. Medieval cooks used every tool available to prevent waste and ensure survival. Breakfast was the oddest meal of the day. Unlike our light cereals or toast, medieval breakfasts were heavy and practical. Thick porridge made from barley, oats, or rye was common, often sour or mixed with bits of meat or fish. Bread was dense, sometimes stale, eaten with cheese, butter, or honey. Breakfast wasn't about enjoyment but about fueling the body for the demanding day ahead. Nobles might enjoy wine and spiced breads, but peasants needed quick energy, often eaten standing up or on the way to work. Underlying all these food customs was a complex system of health beliefs based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor represented qualities like hot, cold, wet, and dry, and illness was thought to stem from imbalance among them. Foods were classified by these qualities, and people chose what to eat based on what their bodies needed to stay balanced. Spices and cooking methods were medicinal tools. Hot and dry foods like garlic or mustard were eaten to counteract cold and wet humors, while cold and wet foods like cucumbers and dairy helped balance hot and dry humors. Meals were designed to create harmony, combining contrasting foods to balance the body and mood. Eating was a form of medicine, as important as it was nourishment. Despite its flaws, this medieval worldview shows us how deeply intertwined food and health were. Meals were more than survival, they were rituals of balance, comfort, and culture. So as you settle into sleep, picture the smoky streets filled with vendors, the aroma of roasting nuts and frying pancakes, the heavy pies and sticky honey treats, and the careful balancing act of humors in every meal. The world of medieval junk food was messy, hearty, and full of surprises, an ancient echo of our own cravings and comforts.